Hello and welcome to the Outdoor Recreation Council of BC's September webinar. My name is Ryan Stewart and I'm hosting today's webinar. I'm going to give folks a minute or so to log in. While they do, I would love to know who's out there. The format of these webinars is such that we can't see who you are, so I invite you to jump into the chat and add your name and where you're logging in from. And I'm going to put on my conference planning hat here for a moment as well. As you may know, the ORCBC is planning a conference in Kamloops in May in 2026. You can find out more about it on our website. And I'd love for you, as you're writing in there who you are and where you are, to also add one thing that if you were to come to that conference that you would like to learn. It can be anything, doesn't matter what the topic is. Maybe how to use AI in what you're doing, what your role is, or how to get involved in land planning processes or ideas for sustainable funding, whatever it is. We're in the midst of our request for proposals, and we'll be reviewing those soon. And I would just, it's just nice to know what people are interested in and what they want to learn and what they would like to get out of a conference like that. So yeah, please log in there and add those comments. And while you're doing that, I'll just let you know a little bit about our webinar today. We are talking about the designing trails with people and carnivores in mind, and we have the authors of an ORCBC guidebook on this topic to tell us more. We will be leaving lots of time for questions after their presentation. You can pop those into the Q&A at any time. And I will also mention that we are recording and we will email you a recording along with lots of takeaways and resources and links and things like that that come up in today's discussion. So yeah, let's see how things are going there in the chat. Getting lots of great responses here. All right. Thanks for everybody logging in there. Okay, I think I will share my screen and we will start this up for real now. Okay. Hello again. As I said, my name is Ryan Stewart. I work in community engagement for the ORCBC. That includes organizing and hosting our webinars. And we're going to get started. So welcome to the Designing Trails for People and Wildlife webinar. Our conversation will focus on trail development guidelines to minimize disturbance to and conflict with large carnivores. This is an ORCBC publication. It includes 15 guidelines for how to better balance the excitement of trail development with the needs of protecting large carnivores like bears, cougars, and wolves. You can find the guidelines on the ORCB website under resources, and I will drop a link into the chat here in a few minutes. Our guests today are the authors of the guidebook. They wrote the publication for the ORCBC to fill a void. There's a lot of ongoing research in the field of recreation ecology or better understanding the interaction between natural ecosystems, wildlife, and recreating humans. But there's not a lot of information that translates this knowledge into tips, advice, best practices for the people that are planning, building, and maintaining trails. Our goal with today's webinar and discussion is to unpack the guidelines, try to make them as usable as possible, and answer any questions you might have. Before we dive in, I have a little housekeeping to do. First, I'd like to thank the BC License Plate Program. The guidebook was made possible with funding from the program. When you buy or renew your BC Parks license plate, it goes into a pool of funds that go out and do all kinds of good stuff. It helps protect plants and animals in the places they live. It funds First Nation educational programs and signs. It employs student rangers, funds Discovery Parks ambassador programs, goes into maintenance of parks, trails, and signs, helps parks protect areas, and adapt and recover from wildfires, and teach visitors about nature. This webinar is part of what the Outdoor Recreation Council of BC does. I like working for the ORCBC because it's a unique group. It's one of the only organizations, I think, in the country that represents a very diverse group of recreating clubs and associations. And it's really, in BC, represents anyone that has a passion for the outdoors. We represent more than 100 nonprofit organizations, including the clubs that build and maintain many of the province's trails. They in turn represent more than 200,000 British Columbians. They're everybody from snowmobilers and hunters and climbers and hikers, conservation organizations, and mountain bike clubs. It's a very diverse group, but they share a love for spending time in wild places. We advocate, educate, and empower these groups. And as a nonprofit, we rely on outside funding sources to do everything we do. You can support our work by making a donation. There's a button on our homepage, and you can direct the funds to some different projects within our work scope, including the Outdoor Recreation Fund. This is a pool of money that is granted to recreation projects across the province every year. The grant intake begins next month, and our December webinar will dig into best practices for applying to the fund. You can find out more at orcbc.ca. I would also like to acknowledge that I am grateful to live, work, and play on the traditional territory of the Comox First Nation here on Vancouver Island. In the spirit of reconciliation, we made a donation to the Stay Kaha Learning Society. It's an Indigenous nonprofit working to return the Cowichan people to an historic village site on Salt Spring Island. They plan to use the site to reestablish native species and connect the nation's youth with their culture and traditions. Okay, so let's get on to today's webinar. Here's the agenda. I'll introduce our two guests. They'll make a presentation, and then we'll have a dedicated question and answer session. If you have any questions during the webinar, please post them in the Q&A. One of our guests might answer them directly. Otherwise, I'll do my best to ask them during the Q&A session. I apologize in advance if I don't get to every question. We'll wrap things up around 1 p.m. Pacific time, and immediately following the webinar is a super short survey. Please stick around to fill it out. It helps us do a better job with these webinars and is an opportunity for you to let us know about topics you'd like us to cover. As I mentioned earlier, our guests today are the authors of the Trail Development Guidelines. Maggie Scallion is the Division Manager of the Trails and Outdoor Recreation Infrastructure team with McElhanney. She has worked on sustainable trail design across Canada. And Kim Titchener is the founder of Bear Safety and More, whose career has focused on helping agencies and communities reduce wildlife conflicts through science-based management and education. She also does a lot of media interviews when there are carnivore and recreating people conflicts, and she's been busy with that lately, and I'm sure we'll get into that in a little bit. Thank you both for being here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand things over to Maggie and Kim.
Thanks, Ryan. I think you guys can see my screen now. Yep. Looks like it. Yeah, yep. So Ryan did a great job of introducing us, so I won't say too much more on that. But I will say that this guide that we developed was done completely as a donation to the ORCBC, because both Kim and myself and some of our other supporters in this project really felt like it was a gap and it was much needed. So we were more than happy to do this totally for free, to create a resource for trail developers and recreationalists in Canada. Yeah, so there's been a ton of research and lots more happening all the time on how human use disturbs animals. There's lots of recommendations on how to mitigate human impacts for the better of wildlife, but there was a bit of a gap in connecting those dots. So how can trail developers actually minimize disturbance and conflict, and how can we manage human behavior a little bit more effectively? And even more so, how can we manage human behavior before it involves putting up signage? So yeah, the guide and a kind of our presentation today covers a few of the highlights of things that we think are important or key guidelines to keep in mind. And yeah, like the sign says, let's figure it out. To give you a bit of scope on, because we were donating our time, we needed to hone in on what we were going to talk about, and we decided to focus on carnivores, so bears, cougars, and wolves in a non-winter natural surface environment, and specifically non-motorized recreation. And that just helped us narrow down our research and create like a manageable set of guidelines. these can largely be applied, like the principles behind them, across many different types of human wildlife conflict, whether it's ungulates or like invasive species. There's a bunch of things that can be applied here as well, but we, in doing our research, just needed to have a manageable bite-sized chunk. And the other big thing is that targeting carnivores are that's kind of what creates fear. So a lot of people are scared of bear attacks, and so this kind of creates that solution that solves a lot of those fear problems, hopefully, and kind of demystifies bears and wolves and cougars and makes people more excited to be in the great outdoors. Kim.
Speaking of which, I'm sure all of you have been watching the news the last few days, and it feels like, oh my gosh, there's so many attacks by these species, and it's overwhelming. And as Maggie was saying, that this, of course, reduces tolerance for species. It can, of course, lead to delisting and more hunting of them or removal of them from many landscapes. And also a lot of fear for people. And we do want people to get out and enjoy nature. We just want them to do it with the respect and training that they need and require, really, to get out there and do it in a way that's safe, so that they can be out there. And if we don't have people out there enjoying nature, we don't have people having value for natural places and spaces, or the wildlife that live there. And that, of course, impacts our ability to have these beautiful trails and protected areas, and encourage the types of recreation that we all, of course, love to do. So before we get into this a bit more, I'm an educator. Any chance I get to talk to people about why bears attack, or what you can do not to get attacked by a bear or cougar or wolf, I'm going to take advantage of it. So, but I want to be really clear on what the issues are that we are seeing out there before we get into trail design, because it is so impactful and so related. So why do bears attack? Grizzly bears are a highly defensive species. Black bears can be sometimes as well. And so surprise encounters are a common one, and that definitely plays a role, of course, in trail systems and how we create them, so that we aren't creating a situation where people end up in close range encounters with these animals, and there's not a lot of time for an animal or a person to make a decision about how they're going to respond. We're invading their space, cornering them by accident in some of these places, encroaching on them when they have a food source or young with them. Certainly the last few cases of bear attacks that have happened in the last few weeks have all been related to defensive grizzly attacks. But there have also been some surprise black bear attacks recently as well, in British Columbia, also including dogs off leash being a major factor. Predatory behavior, of course, is another issue, where bears, take advantage of that forest edge, and there being a lot of dense habitat to be able to sneak up on people. Of course, food-seeking behavior that we are seeing, certainly in the U.S., in the lower 48, we're starting to see more cases of black bears coming into campgrounds, attacking the person, and then grabbing their food and running. So it's like the hot dog run. And it's the new food-seeking type of category that has been discovered with more recent research. So this, of course, is concerning for us in trail design and campground design, in ensuring that we're not creating situations where this could then start happening. Provocation, where people think, oh, I'll just scare them away, or shoot off a bear banger or a firearm, and they do it in a situation where they're in a defensive encounter with a bear, and it actually makes the situation worse and increases the chances of them being mauled or killed. And dogs off leash, are another big issue, as I just mentioned, with them running ahead on the trail or off into the bush. And then they come upon a bear, the bear gets defensive and then chases the dog. And of course, the dog comes back to the human. And then the bear sees the human and they're like, oh my gosh, there's two of them. I gotta deal with them too. And then they attack the person. And we've had attacks like that in Maple Ridge, as well as in Squamish this year. So for us human beings, we do a lot of things when we're out in nature that put us at high risk. Working alone, recreating alone, bushwhacking, going off trail, playing music, got the earbuds in, listening to music, not being aware of our surroundings, or blasting music on our smartphones, thinking, oh, they'll hear, Metallica playing and they'll get out of the way, right? Not being aware of your surroundings, and if you can't hear because you're blasting Metallica or maybe some Cardi B, you might have an animal that might sneak up on you, and the bears might not actually know that sound means that you're coming in their direction. It may not travel far enough. Children left unattended is one of the big categories for risky behaviors. People unfortunately letting their kids run down the trail ahead of them or straggle behind. People not carrying bear spray. Every time I get a call from the media and they're like, "Hey Kim, there's been an attack. A person's been attacked by a cougar or a bear." Most often the person doesn't have bear spray on them, or they didn't get it out in time because they didn't have it accessible. Both black bears and wolves can be attracted, of course, to human food, and hand feeding is definitely a concern. We've seen a number of cases in BC and Alberta where wolves have become food conditioned and then started to approach people, and in some cases even bite people as well. And of course, the topic of biking and e-biking always comes up when it comes to encounters. Activities that are high speed, like running and biking, certainly can cause these close range encounters, and sometimes cause the instinctive chase in some of these predators like cougars. We definitely do see that with cougars, and we also, close range encounters with bears and surprise encounters, and then of course activities that are quiet, such as fishing and hunting, which of course we've had several attacks recently of fishermen as well as hunters getting mauled. All right, next slide. Should have done the hair twist.
Yeah. Thanks, Kim. Yeah, and so the way we've organized both the guide and our presentation today is first we talk about planning and how you can help minimize areas of conflict through good trail planning. We follow that up with design, and then we deal with kind of the operational things. And that's really the best way to do it, deal with kind of the problems, and then start looking at the symptoms if we can't actually deal with the root problem. So just to clarify, what is trail planning versus trail design? So when we talk about trail planning, we're looking at who are the trail users, what do the trail users want, what are their constraints and opportunities, what already exists, where you plan to develop trails or where you already have a trail system. So those are kind of the 30,000-foot view perspectives. And then with trail design, it's more kind of the micro details of where the actual trail will go. And that can be a trail or a network of trails, whatever it is. But basically how that trail interacts with the specificities of the landscape. Yeah, and I use an example. A lot of times, like McElhanney will get hired to do a trail design project. Like we had one in Cape Breton Highlands National Park where there was a climate event and a whole bunch of trails were damaged by flooding events. And we were hired to redesign those trails to be more climate resilient. And what we actually realized as we were going through the process is that what they really needed was more of a trail plan, because they didn't really understand which users they were sending to which trail, how prepared those users needed to be for that specific trail. And all of their trails were kind of the same. So we ended up kind of zooming them back out, preparing a trail plan that said, okay, this is your more advanced trail where people need to be more prepared and educated and able to deal with being remote from a trailhead and from help. And this over here is going to be your trail where you send everybody because it's relatively protected. The instances of wildlife on the trail are much lower, and it is good for people with mobility issues. So we like to separate kind of that planning and design perspective and make sure that people are thinking about everything and not just trail design or where the big hip jump is going to be or the tabletop. So trail planning, we had a number of recommendations. You can see them on the screen, and I'll go through them one by one here on how you can kind of use your planning phase to help minimize human-wildlife interactions. And the big things there are just doing those baseline studies or finding those baseline studies that can inform where and how you place trails. So looking at existing land use plans, there's certain parts of the province that actually have recreation access management plans, which are very helpful. And BC is doing some forest landscape planning now as well, which can present some opportunities because they do have an environmental component. So in areas that have been designated as high value habitat, they should be probably not forested, but also your trail density and your recreation impact should also be minimized in those areas as well. It's not like a jackpot, no forestation, no logging, therefore we're going to put a bunch of trails here. It should be, okay, let's just chill out and let this space be for the animals. And then obviously any sort of environmental or ecological study that you can do prior to diving into a trail planning project is very helpful. It allows trail planners to understand what the limitations are in the landscape. And I'm a big fan of like thinking about trail densities beyond just trail placement. So if there's an area that's important, grizzly habitat, summer range, because there's a lot of berries there, then you really need to think about how many trails you want in that area and how much space you're leaving between trails so that the bears have that opportunity to kind of feed uninterrupted from humans. And then there's always the opportunity as well in the planning phase to set up in conjunction with the environmental team, simple repeatable studies to monitor wildlife prior to, during, and after construction and throughout operations. Those can be wildlife cameras, public reporting mechanisms, or even just having a plot of land where people go and look for tracks. All that type of stuff really helps you monitor your impact and see how successful your planning has been. So one of the big recommendations that comes up is obviously to avoid high value habitat, and high value habitat tends to be high value trail building habitat too. So it's kind of a rock and a hard place there, but you see what you can do and do what you can is kind of the big thing here. And again, trail densities, I'll bring that up a few times, but reducing trail density, bundling trails, things like that, and the really high value habitat can go a long way. So key areas to avoid are riparian areas, so any wet, flat areas. Personally, I love to avoid those because I don't want to build bridges, because not the hypothetical type of bridge, the literal type of bridge. They're expensive and they require a lot of inspection, maintenance, and replacement. So just stay out of wet areas. Valley bottoms, again, they're flat. They're not the best for trail building. Rivers and lakes, great viewpoints. But what we recommend with rivers and lakes is, yeah, go there, have a view, but don't run your trail along the river or along the lake. Use it for a viewpoint, but don't use it as an anchor for your trail. If you're expecting a lot of winter use in your trail system, stay away from steep slopes near the alpine or south-facing cliffs. Those tend to be really important denning areas. Avalanche paths for spring and early summer use. Well, avalanche paths really any time of the year because you don't want to get snuffed in the winter, and bears love them in the spring and summer for feeding opportunities. And then for summer trails, alpine, subalpine, and montane meadows are obviously important feeding habitats. And then if you have known dens, day beds, and home sites, cougar or coyotes tend to reuse dens, as do wolves, I believe, as well. So if there's known sites, just stay away from them. You might wonder what's left. Yeah, so things to consider. Where could you actually put a trail? Moraine features are typically not super popular with animals. Steep forested slopes, which is great for bench cutting trails, sustainable trail building 101. Cliffs make beautiful viewpoints, and animals really have no use for viewpoints other than in The Lion King, which might be slightly dramatized. Deep drainages, ravines, those are areas where it's difficult to get to the water source. So again, animals don't have a typical use for those zones, and they're often better places to put bridges or kind of destination bridges. Like if you're thinking of, oh, we need to cross this river, like let's do it once and let's make it spectacular. And then avoid or think about alpine use seasonally. So late summer and fall, once the most of the kind of root flowers and attractants that are there for food go away, those can be used for trails at that time of year. So I'd say one of the big takeaways from kind of this ecological perspective is that seasonality does play a big role in where you put trail users. Maybe it has less of an impact on the trails themselves, but definitely it does with trail users. And we talk a little bit about closures, whether they be seasonal or temporal, in the operations section, but something just to flag here from a planning perspective. And then the other key thing to think about from a planning concept is that you want to use positive control points rather than positive miles and miles and miles and miles. So think about that one great view of the lake or that really special place along the river. And so make your trails interesting and your viewpoints worthy. The other kind of thought that really applies to the planning phase of trail development is demand management. And that's how many people do you want on your trail? How many people can your trail handle? And how can you manage your trail to maintain that user goal? I see a lot of communities, they think of trails as a great economic stimulus, and they don't think about that worst case scenario of Lake Louise where people can't even get there anymore because there's just too many humans. So you want to plan for that evolution of use and think about, well, what if there is 500 people a day coming up here, like Joffrey Lakes or something like that. So if you have those types of considerations in mind, you want to look at siting trailheads, popular trails, and intense use areas away from high value habitat. So if you're building a trail that can be walked by 1 million people, don't put it around Lake Louise. Start it a little ways before Lake Louise, take people to the lake to a viewpoint, and then head back out somewhere else so that we don't have humans like encircling the lake and prohibiting wildlife access. You can bundle trails or like spread them apart by 400 meters. So there's large gaps of wilderness in between trails. Identify your peak and desired use volumes. Think about making trails directional so that you don't have the out and back trampling, the trail widening, all that type of stuff to deal with. And consider how trail use can be managed in the sense of closures, phased addition of new trails. Like, what's your plan B to Lake Louise? Is it going to be Moraine Lake and then Lake O'Hara and then Emerald Lake? Like, how can we spread that use around to all these other spectacular lakes in the area without overloading one? And yeah, and then just trail system design. We talk about stacked loop trail systems being really handy, but also a linear trail system can sometimes be less impactful from a perspective of the entire landscape. And then this is a photo of a cup lock where we laid out a really nice mountain bike trail system for a private client. But thinking about the intended activity types, which you really should be thinking about at the trail planning phase. Is it for mountain bikers? Is it a multi-use network? How fast are your users going? How much noise do they make, like motorized versus non-motorized? And what impacts do those things have on the environment? And then also dogs, like we've actually added dogs allowed, not allowed, or on leash to our trail classification mechanism because those do have a big impact on the wildlife. Thinking about trails for skill progression. So we see mountain bike trails, dirt bike riding. Those are kind of the big things where people have like a skill progression kind of trail network where they practice different skills before they move on to another set or another level of skill. And so those areas that see repetitive use should be definitely placed away from high value habitat again. And then just summer use, winter use. Yeah. And this was a mountain bike trail system that we put some high-speed flow trails in and a climb trail. It's used by cattle for grazing in the summer. And it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, so there's definitely bears in the area. You see lots of scat there all the time, but the sight lines are great, and it's going to continue to be mowed down by cows. So it's actually kind of a great place to have a remote flow trail system. Yeah, and then so now that we've talked about trail planning, the 30,000-foot view, we can dive into trail design. And so this is specifically where those trails end up on the landscape. And so we say, oh, don't build trails in areas of high value. And yeah, I already talked about that. But specifically when we talk about design, don't use game trails. Stay out of flat areas. Like those are the things that you're actually going to encounter in the landscape when you're doing your trail design. And you're also going to see things like berry patches, unmapped water sources, for example, and then log jams, sandbar locations in rivers and streams. That's where wolves and bears hunt and scavenge fish. So all of those things, that again pops up in trail design, and those are things you need to be thinking about when you're laying out trail. And I highly advocate to separate trail planning from trail construction, because we find a lot of times when you do a design build that they're designing the trail with a chainsaw in their hand and a machine not far behind them. And so when they come across something, they don't do a good job of avoiding it or fixing the problem. They tend to do like a Band-Aid solution to it. So it really makes sense to have a committed design team that finds the best route, finds all those positive controls and the negative controls, and lays out the trail through the landscape in that way. Things that you can do if you have to cross through an area where you think that there is good potential for wildlife to be as well is to reduce trail speed. And so mountain biking, trail running, reducing the turn radius or radii so that people have to go slower. It's a little more janky. That's a great way to slow people down. You can use mature trees to create kind of that chicane slalom effect and selectively clear branches for sightlines and corralling. Leaving larger protrusions on the trail surface, so rocks, roots, and others, also tends to slow people down. Technical trail features. And then when you're considering where you put your junctions and rest nodes, again, those things should be kept away from those really high value areas. And then I see this a lot in Canmore, where you're kind of like rolling along a trail and going fast, and you kind of whip around a corner, and sometimes you run into someone else because literally they can't see you and you can't see them. So it's not only trees and foliage that ruin sight lines, it's also like terrain features. And so using gravity to naturally slow users before blind crests or turns, so making the trail go uphill so people are actually going slow around those corners, is quite useful. Yeah. And I'll use an example from the Canmore Area Trail Strategy, which we're currently working on. Canmore has a number of wildlife corridors and wildlife patches that were established in, I think it was the mid-90s. And they were adhered to pretty well. But then pretty much COVID happened and a whole bunch of illegal trail building got out of control. And now the wildlife corridors and wildlife patches are spaghetti mazes of trails as well. And so Alberta Parks and Alberta Public Lands wanted to get things in hand. And I use this example, I know it's not British Columbia, but it is a very relevant current project that we're working on, that we've worked in depth with bear biologists and people studying wildlife behavior to create a situation in a very densely used recreation area for solutions, and it's something that we're going to be able to see results from in real time over the next decade. So it's kind of an exciting project. So when I talk about bundling trails, this is what it looks like. And this is one of the examples that we're working with in the Canmore Area Trail Strategy. So we've put along the bottom and top of a wildlife corridor or patch two main trails that are bundled closely together. Not on the same trail tread, but they are closely together in the same corridor. And we've put pedestrians and equestrians on one trail, and then the blue trail below, it's mountain bikers and trail runners. So separating people by speed and putting the slower users closer to the wildlife area and the faster users away from it. And you see that as well on those trail bundles that cross through the patch or the corridor. Again, we're putting that slower user, so a mountain bike climb trail or the pedestrian equestrian kind of on the edges, and putting the mountain bike descent trails, the fastest trails, sandwiched in between those slower users. And then the other big thing that we recognize is that everybody likes to go for a walk in their bathrobe with their dog in the morning. And they want to do it not on the sidewalk in front of their house, but in the woods behind their house. And so where you have a wildlife corridor or patch that immediately butts against a residential area, you get a lot of undesired activity in that wildlife patch. And so creating a kind of linear, narrow network behind all the houses so people can have their kind of natural experience close to their house in the morning is a definitely key recommendation that we've moved forward in both the plan and the design of trails in Canmore. And from a mountain bike perspective, designing kind of the flow networks or the mountain bike specific networks. Typically, we're putting those above the wildlife corridors and patches in those high value winter habitats, with the climb trails on the outside, and then a number of descent trails that link back into the climb trail before it crosses into the habitat patch. Yeah, and so then the last thing I say about kind of trail design is to remember that you want to plan construction for seasons and times of the year with less disturbance. So winter and spring are really high stress for animals because they're hungry or they're asleep and then they're hungry. So you want to focus on midsummer, fall, which typically tends to be better in Western Canada anyway when it comes to dry and positive weather. Do not do construction overnight or at dawn and dusk, and plan for attractant removal prior to construction. So remove those berry bushes before they flower or fruit. So during your tree clearing windows, think about removing those attractant bushes as well. And then design trailside amenities to manage use volume. So size parking lots appropriately, use filters. So put the most difficult part of the trail first so that people don't get in over their heads. Reduce the number of trailside amenities such as benches in areas where you don't want users that can't handle it. And then consider trail width as well to reduce group sizes. One other thing that kind of popped up in a recent webinar I watched was vegetation management along trails, and recommending that as part of your trail design and construction, you actually intentionally seed alongside the trail with bushes that are not attractants to animals and also that preserve sight lines if desirable. Kim.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so of course the other piece to trail design and of course is human management, and before we get into that, of course it's removing the things that cause us problems, and people of course are a big part of that, like with human foods, but vegetation management is a key piece. With bears, you know, their primary food sources in the summer and spring, summer, and fall, you know, they're going to be on the sides of trails where there's lots of good food sources. They're going to be eating berries. And of course, we build trails most often in places where, of course, those things proliferate. And sunshine comes in, and bears are like, "This is amazing," and they're going to want to go in those areas where that forest canopy is opened up, which of course increases the chances of us having close range encounters with these animals. And it's not just them; it's also their prey species are also following those trails. It is the path of least resistance. And bears and other wildlife do want to choose for the easiest route to get from point A to B, kind of like us. And so they end up using these same trails as well. Uh, we also, of course, create edge habitat through the creation of trails, and cougars love that. They like to hide in that forest edge, waiting for prey species to walk by. And again, this goes back to me saying like supervising children is so important because they're running down the trail ahead of you. They can be perceived as a potential prey source when they're by themselves. So, improving your lines of sight is so important. And of course, muffled sounds, and it just makes it so hard for these animals to know that you're there, smell, hear, and see you. Historically in Alberta and in British Columbia, in the past, land management and forest fire management, of course, worked very hard at not having forest fires. And unfortunately with that, we end up with a lot of thick forested canopies, and I can go on and on about what's happened with forest fires and fire management, but you don't want me to go down that road. But what has happened is it means that there's a lack of opening in those forests for those natural food sources, and forest fire, of course, creates those processes and opens up canopies and creates great foods for bears. And so bears end up being drawn into features like trails, campgrounds in our communities. Of course, they come into our backyards and our golf courses, and of course in industry, we see them in forestry cut blocks within the first 2 years after they've been cleared, and pipeline right of ways. So a lot of the areas where human beings are, they end up coming in because they're willing to take the risk of being near people because those food sources are so important to them. Of course, this leads to conflicts with these animals and spikes, and we definitely see a spike in attacks definitely during the summer period, and there is a direct correlation between berry season and unfortunately bear attacks, and of course a lot of them being defensive. As far as what do we do, how do we deal with this? These guidelines do recommend the removal of natural foods of 1.5 meters on either side of the trail. In Kananaskis country, in Banff National Park, in Canmore, Alberta, all of these areas have done extensive berry bush removal, and even recently during the G7, so which people thought were for Donald Trump, but it wasn't for him. It was for the wildlife. So this has been very successful, and of course reassuring to trail users and community members who can now go down a trail at the Canmore Nordic Center, and they can see very well on either side of them, and that will inevitably help to reduce conflicts with these species. And it's not just important for us to do this on our trails in provincial parks and national park systems. It's also, as Maggie's talking about, people do walk out their backyard and they jump onto a local trail or game trail. They want to take their dog for a quick walk. And we do see a lot of people that are going for a walk at nighttime, often walking their dog, and they're getting into these attack scenarios. And we've had a number of them this year already in British Columbia. And we want to try to avoid that on municipal trails as well. So I know in my work with WildSmart, which is an organization that works on human wildlife conflict, we actually started a volunteer program and got local residents to help us go out and actually remove berry bushes on either side of the trail, which was very successful. It helped people feel like they were part of solutions of trying to live with these animals, and we had a really positive response to people doing that. Okay, next slide. All right, so if you get a chance to look at the guidelines, you'll also note that there is a literature review that you can look through, and one of the papers in there is by Dr. Stephen Herrero, who is he's kind of like the godfather of bear biology and ecology and bear attacks, and has done a ton of work trying to understand why people get attacked. And of course, he was involved in helping figure out where trails should be put in Kananaskis when they were creating their trail planning systems. And I found this little snippet here from him mentioning this one area called French Creek, and that he said, don't build a trail here. And this is why these environmental assessments are so important. There was an incredible amount of grizzly bear, very important grizzly bear habitat in that area. And fortunately, the government planners agreed, and they didn't build a trail. Adjacent, though, to that area, they built a trail called Burstal Pass. And what inevitably happened is either it was a game trail, or just people started using it because it was adjacent to a creek, and they ended up not going into Burstal, but also then creating this non-designated trail that they started using called French Creek. This ended up online. It ended up in books on Kananaskis, and inevitably people started using it. Unfortunately, this family, Maya and her son, one day went on that exact trail that was not supposed to exist. And they walked around a corner because it was highly vegetated. It wasn't managed properly. And they walked right into a grizzly bear feeding on a moose carcass 5 meters off the side of the trail. And both of them were mauled. These are things that we don't want to have happen. And this is why, of course, it is important to ensure that when we're creating designated trails, we're ensuring that we're keeping people out of and away from these non-designated trails, because this is the kind of thing that can happen because of that. We'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So recently, a new paper came out, which I was super excited about, because signage makes me crazy. Alone by itself, it's not very useful. I know Maggie showed that cartoon there at the very start. We might do better by just training the bears and helping them to learn to read, so they would know to avoid us instead, because by itself, signage is a pretty useless thing. It can be used and incorporated into social media marketing, planning, education, as a reminder. There are some good places and uses for signage, but it's got to be a useful sign. This side here is terrifying to me. Warning, grizzly bear, you will be subject to, possible attack, hike at your own risk. Well, that doesn't make me want to go hiking there. And it also doesn't tell me why, it tells me I could get killed by a bear, but it doesn't tell me how to behave so that I won't get killed by a bear at the same time. And I love this. This is up in the right hand corner. I found this on one of the local, I think it was it was in Nelson, and a local person had actually created their own sign and saying, hey, there's a mama bear here. This is why you shouldn't go in here, give her some space. And I loved it because it was timely and it was transparent. But there is more literature. There is a lot more that we can learn through the understanding of the psychology of human beings. We can be manipulated, absolutely. Back in the day when I was running my programs working with communities on human-wildlife conflict, I worked primarily with some of Dr. Dr. Mackenzie Moore's work, which looked at social marketing and fostering behavior change. This most recent paper out of the University of Alberta is again looking at how can we use signage in a way that actually does call people to action and changes their behavior. So unfortunately, they did find in this study, and they surveyed Canmore residents, social pressure, friends groups don't impact behavior change. So trying to use that tactic is not going to work. You've got to focus on internalized morals, using I and we statements, frame compliance as a value, tailor messaging to local wildlife, be as specific as you can. I think transparency from government and saying, well, there's actually is a female grizzly bear with 3 cubs. That is a useful thing for people to know. And taking down signage when that warning or closure is gone, because if it just stays up and it's there all winter long, we totally ignore signage. We know that it's not actually timely and useful. And also, I think of myself. So I've been pushing bear spray and trying to get people to carry bear spray for 20 something years now. And I just know it's a moral value for me. Like, I would never go out. I wouldn't be caught dead, right? Like, if they find my body and I don't have a can of bear spray, get one and put it with me, because That is such a core value for me that I would never go out and do that. So you have to try to educate. This is what we'll get into next, is we have to help people create these moral values and know what it is they have to do to be impactful in coexisting with these animals. And if they don't know what to do, they can't create a value for that for themselves. Next slide. So education. So I spent almost 10 years being the founder and running an organization called Wild Smart in the Bow Valley, working with multiple levels of government, recreational groups, environmental organizations, and community members, trying to educate the public. We created a multi-tiered system to wildlife management in the region, including, of course, removal of berry bushes and wildlife attractants in the community, and of course, trail systems adjacent. We worked on aversive conditioning for a while. We had Carillion bear dogs. We had some really great programs going on with that. And then lastly, year round, we were doing wildlife education programs to address all the different species that we live with. So when those bears go to bed, we don't go to bed ourselves thinking about wildlife. We also have to realize that there are other species that we can have conflicts with. So, education is, like I said, signage is a reminder tool. We do need to have things like reminding people that, not to litter. Dogs shouldn't be off leash. We do encourage things like mandatory groups of 4. So trying to get people to understand what they should be doing when they're out there, why it is important to do those things. And of course, providing bear and wildlife safety training. And so we actually got the town of Canmore to make a day in the springtime in April, Bear Days. And every year we open up the community to having a whole bunch of educational programs. We teach people how to use bear spray. We bring in bear traps so people can go inside them and see what they're like, and have speakers come in and actually talk about these animals so that we can connect them to them and understand what they need to do when they're out there on the trails. Another piece to psychology and manipulating people for in a positive way so they can be safer is to reinforce good behavior. And so one of the tactics that I used was to actually go around and start doing some reinforcement through gifting. So we actually went out with our volunteers and we would go out on the trails, we would go to dog parks. If we saw people with their dogs, bring them to an off-leash park instead of going on the trail with an off-leash dog. We're like, here's a chocolate bar. And we got a local chocolatier to offer us up chocolate bars. We got leashes donated. And then people started to go, oh, I'm a good person. I take my dog to the off-leash park. It became a value. It became part of who they are and a part of their ego. And so then, they'll think twice the next time they go on a trail and think, oh, should I take my dog off leash? Oh no, I can't. I now value this as something that I know to be a safer thing to do when I'm out there. Okay, next slide. How are we doing for time? Oof. Oh, expectations versus reality. Back in the day when I was in university, that was a long time ago. We were using, Lake Louise as the example of what not to do, and we still are to this day. And unfortunately, it's gotten way worse than, of course, it used to be. A lot of people are around the world seeing these beautiful views, like Moraine Lake, and like, oh, I can't wait to get there. Nobody's there. It's going to be fantastic. And then they get there and they realize they've got to go on a bus, and now they got to spend $100, and they're in these giant lines, and they're trying to get a selfie between, everybody else. And then they get back on the bus and they're gone. And it's sad what's happened, right? And none of us want that. And as Maggie said, that's why it's important to have some setup for plan A, plan B, plan C, so that when you have your higher tour season, you have offerings of other areas that they can go to and streamline them to those areas so they're not having as much impact in other places. And of course, with that, identifying maximum use limits, reducing parking lot sizes can help if you're trying to keep those numbers lower. Consider permits or pass systems, which is, what's happened in Banff National Park. You have to take a bus, or you have to hire a private company to take you to some of these trailheads. And that, of course, has helped to reduce that. With 20,000 plus people going to see Lake Louise every day, it gets to a point where it's too much. And we're definitely past that at this point. And then, of course, reducing trail amenities, as she mentioned, less signage, even having things like, no dogs allowed in these areas can, of course, help local wildlife if you are having a lot of problems with conflicts in that area with dogs. It is something to absolutely consider. Because dogs are now becoming more and more of an issue with people getting themselves hurt by wildlife because their dog is off leash, and it's something we need to really look at and address. All right, next slide. Closures. People really do need to understand why we have them. This bear, he can read. He actually knows that it says due to extreme grizzly bear hazard. I love this. I don't even know where I got this. It's crazy, but it's pretty fun. But people have to have a value for that, whether it's their own safety, their family safety, their dog safety, or they actually understand that there is a bear with 3 cubs who's feeding on a moose carcass, and she's bluff charged 5 people already in the last week. This is why the area is closed. Like, be transparent, be specific, be timely in that information so that people actually understand why we don't want you to go on the other side of that closure tape. It's for a very good reason, but you have to explain what that is. You can't just say area closed due to extreme grizzly bear hazard. You're not going to have bears showing up to let people know that this is not a good idea. Going back to the education piece, I do strongly encourage looking at ambassador type programs. Banff actually has a volunteer ambassador program with people out on the trails talking to users. In the Bow Valley with the Wild Smart program that I ran, we have about 50 volunteers in the community that have been highly trained in going out on the trail systems and speaking to users, reinforcing those positive behaviors, being available to educate and let them know, about bear and wildlife safety. And we also worked with the government agencies to find out where there were bear sightings, where there were conflict issues, and we set we sent our volunteers to those trailheads to ensure that people were aware of those bear warnings, or in some cases even trail closures, so that people could get that in person, which is, there's nothing better than in person having them there explaining things to the public instead. Next slide. And of course, the cute little grizzly bear with the cub, right? So it's, when it comes to wildlife conflict, it's really easy to think about these headlines that we're seeing in the news. And I was on a radio show yesterday, and a famous bear specialist was on there, Reno Summerhold, and he said, bears just want to survive. They just want to survive every day. They want to protect their young. They want to feed, breed, maybe have a bit of fun. And so do human beings. And we have to remember that we are sharing this landscape with them. If we want to continue to live with large carnivores, we have to be the ones that make compromises in the way that we create and design our trail systems, and the type of use that we have on them, and carrying capacities for them, and also educate our user groups so that they're out there and they're having amazing, safe, beautiful, memorable experiences, but not having horrible experiences where people are getting hurt and killed. With new and old trails, we have the ability to change the narrative, to give wildlife and people a chance to experience an environment that is less impactful. We can do better. I know we can. I know we have some old trails that we go, oh my gosh, this one's in terrible shape, but there are still things that you can do, and looking at these guidelines that can help you to make them better. And we must do better if we want to live with these amazing animals in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for surviving and hopefully enjoying our talk. We're obviously very passionate about this. It means a lot to us. Feel free to reach out. You kind of know our specialties. Kim has done just amazing things in education. She's why I carry bear spray. And yeah, McElhanney specializes obviously in trail design, planning, and construction oversight. And I did want to just throw out there as special promotion today only. No, actually, for as long as you guys want, we can do for your trail system up to 10 kilometers a wildlife assessment, kind of like an inventory and assessment of your trail system, specifically related to kind of managing wildlife interactions. And we'd give you a 1-page report with recommendations on how you could make changes or improvements. And we've kind of lump sum price that at $2,000 for 10 kilometers. So if you're interested in that, or you want a member of my team or myself to come out and see what you have going on, we just want safer trails that meet everybody's expectations.
Thank you both so much. That was a lot of information and so many practical tips and ideas in there. I just want to jump and get a few of the questions from folks in the chat there, and also ones we got before we go. Um, there was those 2 pages you had where you were talking about, places to avoid for trails and places that were good for trails, and there was a lot of seasonal talk in there of, this time of year this time of year is better or whatever. How do you see managing that? Is that the trails are only open at that time? Is it a education sort of social value sort of thing, like don't go here at this time of year, or what do you see as a way of managing that seasonality of it?
Yeah, I'm personally a big fan of temporal closures, recognizing that nothing's going to be perfect or work out perfectly, but if you can have good ambassadors, good education, put it not just a sign at the trailhead, but on all trails in a variety of media, keep it consistent from year to year, and keep it relevant to the what's actually going on in the environment. So, like, if it's whatever, oh, it's berry season. Well, let's start it when the berries are out and end it when the berries are done. Don't be a little bit flexible with it, but be consistent, right?
And then we also had some questions about how to do this sort of work, or with existing trails, and how do are there ways of taking an existing trail and making it more carnivore friendly, and is that sort of adapting it so it's slower maybe, or things like that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that you can do, whether it's from the planning, design, or management perspective. A lot of our recommendations can be applied to brand new trails or existing trail networks. So, for example, your trail's in high value habitat, maybe you need to just press delete, 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 and then redraw it somewhere else. Or maybe it's in berry habitat and you can do a temporal closure. So it's more of an operations type of management.
Okay.
I'll add to that. I'll add to
Yeah.
that, with our communities, they have very, very much so valued a certain trails. So it is tough to do that. So you've got to, like Maggie said, you've got to offer another opportunity, but you've also got to work on an education plan so that people understand why you need to do this when you're going to do this. Let them know that this is happening because we have to consider the habitat, the wildlife. We've had this many people get bluff charged by bears, and this is causing all kinds of problems. So that we're not just cutting it off with no explanation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always think that why, the more you, like you were saying, the transparency, this is why we're doing this. It seems to make a huge difference to people's buy-in to these things if they have that background and understanding. Um, one of the things you talk about early on there and is really important is being able to identify these different habitat types. Are there resources and tools out there for folks that maybe don't have that background knowledge to be able to identify it themselves if they have tight budgets for like doing this sort of, that analysis on obviously an amateur scale, but being able to do at least a little bit of thinking about where those different habitat types are?
Yeah, there's good resources, like the province of BC has a really good GIS database that's publicly available that does a lot of habitat mapping. You need a bit of skill and knowledge to access it and understand it, but it is out there. Um, Crowdsourcing, like there's also environmental organizations all across British Columbia that are more than happy to help protect animals. So I find reaching out to now Wild Smart's in my head, but
Wild site.
there's Wild Site maybe
Mhm.
across British Columbia that I'm sure you could leverage some local knowledge, and then yeah. But I mean, if you're going to be spending $50 a meter on trail construction, or whatever you're spending every year on maintenance, like you need to start weighing your priorities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, so we're a little past 1 o'clock here, so why don't we wrap things up? I have one final question maybe you guys could weigh in on. As recreational pressures continue to rise, what shift in mindset or practice would you challenge every land manager or planner or trail builder to adopt to kind of have that coexistence mindset you kind of ended on there, Kim? Maggie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll just say commit to change. Like I see all the time, it's people get an environmental assessment and then they'll try and figure out how to work around it and not with it. Like it's a sad state of affairs because they want this trail, but oh my gosh, it's at the compromise of this. Well, that's okay. Well, there's lots of space for bears over there. Like I think we all need to start being more responsible with our choices and recognizing that recreation has an impact. It maybe doesn't have as big of an impact as a strip mine, but it does have an impact, and we all have that responsibility to take that first step. And if we don't do it, who's going to do it?
Kim, did you want to add anything there?
I just reiterate what Maggie is saying, and when it comes to conflicts with wildlife, this isn't going away. You know, the user groups that are getting attacked by these animals are often using these trail systems. Number one type of user is the hiker that gets mauled by these animals, walker, hunter, and then camping. And a lot of this stuff is happening in backcountry settings, backcountry camping areas. And we also know from places like Canmore, you know, and Banff National Park, that if we don't manage our trails well, not only do we have conflicts and attacks, but we also, of course, start dissuading people from wanting to even go to those places. You know, local people don't even want to enjoy, they can't. Like, I couldn't tell you, I could tell you that the last time I went for a hike at Moraine Lake was the last time I'll ever go there in my life, because I couldn't stand to be there with the thousands of people and spend $100 to go on a bus to go see a place that I had such a value for. And I also know that because of those high numbers of people there now, that eventually, like, there's a threshold for wildlife where they just stop coming to those places and they will stop. And where do they go? If we want to live with these animals, we have to, like I said earlier, we have to figure out how we're going to make these compromises. And at what point do we do it? Like, we've really got to change our ways.
All right. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. And thanks to everybody who joined us. Please keep an eye on your inboxes later this week for an email with a recording of today's webinar, plus links and materials and contact info for both Kim and Maggie. This webinar is part of a monthly series. We have 2 more coming up. Later this month, we'll have one focused on the importance of archaeological assessment work and how to engage with First Nations on them. And in early December, we'll have one on a webinar dedicated to the Outdoor Recreation Fund. And this coincides with the opening of the next application period for the fund. It's a great chance to ask questions. To find out more about both of these webinars and everything else the Outdoor Recreation Council does, please subscribe to our newsletter at orcbc.ca. And finally, please stick around for the survey. It's a great place to let us know anything you wish we'd cover today or any topics you'd like us to cover in the future. It pops up right after I stop speaking on your web browser. And with that, I'll say good afternoon. Thanks to Maggie and Kim again, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.